At 11 hours GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Valerie Sanderson. America's top infectious disease expert tells the BBC his country's COVID crisis is reaching a new level.
What we're going through now in the United States is really the worst that we've had for the entire 10 months. So that every day, it seems, we almost break a new record.
It comes as the UN makes its biggest ever appeal for aid to help people cope with the pandemic, as well as the effect of famine and war. Optimism on climate change as scientists say action by countries is leading to a slowdown in the rise in average global temperature.
Something has changed in the last few months, and actually our new number on an optimistic scenario now goes to only 2.1 degrees by the end of the century, and that is very positive news.
And will you send a Christmas card this year? After this update.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. The most senior infectious disease expert in the United States says the country is going through the worst stage of its coronavirus outbreak since the pandemic was declared early this year. Anthony Fauci told the BBC new records appear to be set every day. He said the swift development of vaccines looked very promising, but people still needed to take precautions.
There is light at the end of the tunnel, but we're hoping that between now and that time, that people do the simple public health measures that we know can turn around the surges, like wearing a mask uniformly, avoiding close contact, staying out of crowds in congregate settings, particularly indoors. Those are the kind of things that work.
The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development says a gradual but uneven recovery in the global economy should take place in the next 2 years. Its new forecast says overall global economic activity is likely to reach pre-pandemic levels by the end of next year. Here's Andrew Walker.
Recent developments in vaccines underpin a strand of rather cautious optimism in this report. For the first time since the start of the pandemic, it says there's hope for a brighter future. But during the wait for effective vaccines to be widely distributed, the pandemic will still impose economic strains. The OECD says China will grow strongly and will account for more than a third of global growth next year. The rich countries will recover only partially in 2021. The report says that the social and economic fabric of countries has been damaged by the pandemic in spite of what it calls the huge policy band-aid.
Environmentalists in the Netherlands have taken the Anglo-Dutch oil firm Shell to court over its global exploitation of fossil fuels. The 4-day course in the court case in The Hague will hear arguments that Shell broke Dutch law by knowingly hindering the worldwide phasing out of oil and gas. Shell says investment in new technology and changing customers' behaviour is a better way of tackling climate change. The authorities in the Brazilian city of Criciúma say a heavily armed gang set off explosions as they carried out several simultaneous bank robberies. 4 people have been arrested. It's not clear how many gang members were able to flee. Warren Ball reports.
Footage on social media showed the gang discharging their weapons as they arrived in Criciúma in a convoy of vehicles. Explosions and gunshots could then be heard in several places across the city as the gang exchanged fire with local police and raided banks. The local mayor, Clécio Salvador, urged residents to stay in their houses. In a coordinated operation, the gang set up roadblocks, took several hostages and forced other local people to sit in a line in the middle of the street.
News from the BBC. Scientists say the average global temperature could rise at a slower rate than previously feared, thanks to recent commitments by some of the world's biggest polluters. The Climate Action Tracker study suggests the Earth will be 2.1 Celsius warmer by the end of the century. The Paris Climate Agreement aims for a 2-degree increase. Nicholas Herner helped produce the study.
The biggest changes are because China has also said to move to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2060. And the US, President-elect Biden, has proposed also to go to zero. And if you count them all together, we come up with 127 countries which have now said that they are considering going to zero emissions. And they cover 2/3 of global emissions. And if they really do what they promise, then we could get to quite lower temperatures than we thought before.
Residents at the biggest tourist resort on a popular Australian holiday island have been told to get ready to leave because of a massive bushfire. Firefighters are struggling to control the blaze on Fraser Island off the coast of Queensland. It started more than 6 weeks ago. A court in the Pakistani city of Lahore has asked police to explain why no criminal case has been registered against the national cricket captain Babar Azam after a woman accused him of rape. The woman alleges that when she approached police in Nasirabad, they refused to record her statement. The opening of an air travel bubble between Hong Kong and Singapore has been postponed for a second time because of a rise in coronavirus cases. The bubble will allow quarantine-free travel between the two places. The British Formula One racing driver Lewis Hamilton has tested positive for the coronavirus and is self-isolating with mild symptoms. He will miss the next Grand Prix in Bahrain. And those are the latest stories from BBC News.
It's 11:06 GMT. You're listening to the newsroom on the BBC World Service with me, Valerie Sanderson. Around a year after the first coronavirus cases emerged in China, the world is in the grip of a full-blown pandemic, and the United States is one of the worst-hit countries. Over 4 million cases of COVID-19 were diagnosed in the US in November, more than double the total in October. And many fear the Thanksgiving holiday last week, which involved people travelling around the country to visit their families, will produce another surge in cases. America's top infectious disease expert, Dr. Anthony Fauci, is clear about the scale of the problem facing his country. But there is, he says, hope in a vaccine. He's been speaking to Lawrence Pollard.
What we're going through now in the United States is really the worst that we've had for the entire 10 months. So that every day, it seems, we almost break a new record. We have between 100 and 200,000 new cases a day, between 1 and 2,000 deaths per day. And we've broken the record of the number of people in the hospital with COVID-19, more than 90,000 the other day. And the totals of deaths are 266,000 deaths and over 13 million cases. So we really are having a terrible time. And the pattern of it is really exemplified in the Dakotas, where we have almost uninhibited infection, where the infection rate and the test positivity is most extraordinary. And we get now in our country, in North and South Dakota, the weather is such that it really allows only for indoor type of congregating, which is the worst possible thing that you could have when you have a high degree of community spread.
Are people going to push back in the same way against the idea of the vaccine as well? Because some of the percentages of Americans who say they won't or will take the vaccine seem, after 10 months of this agony, also just incomprehensible.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we have in our favor is that, fortunately for us, the degree of efficacy of the vaccine is truly remarkable. The 2 vaccines that are ready to go now and will likely be distributed towards the middle and end of December, it's 94 to 95% effective, and it is almost 100% effective against severe disease. So we are very fortunate that we have 2 vaccines that are almost ready to be deployed among the high priority groups, such as healthcare workers and people in nursing homes and those who have a high risk of a serious outcome. And then as we get into January, February, and March, the next levels of priority will be given. So there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Dr. Anthony Fauci. Well, as 2020 enters its final weeks, it's become clear that the effects of the coronavirus will last well into next year and perhaps for several years to come. Now, the United Nations says it needs to raise $35 billion in 2021 to help millions more people around the world cope with the pandemic, alongside the effects of famine and wars. Mark Lowcock is the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator.
The picture we are presenting is the bleakest and darkest perspective on humanitarian need in the period ahead that we have ever set out, I think. And that is a reflection of the fact that the COVID pandemic has wreaked carnage across the whole of the most fragile and vulnerable countries on the planet.
Well, I got more details from our correspondent in Geneva, Imogen Fuchs.
The United Nations puts this appeal out every year. The fact is, the requests have been growing. We've seen these protracted conflicts in Syria, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, things that are just not getting solved. So the needs are already great, but now we have the COVID-19 pandemic. And let's not forget that for us, perhaps in Europe, we've been able to work from home, we've been able to keep our jobs, or we've been furloughed. But in other countries, people have basically just lost their livelihoods. Their children have not been able to go to school. We've seen things like vaccination programs getting interrupted because of health fears. This all contributes to pushing vulnerable countries into ever more vulnerable situations, and this is why we've got this massive appeal.
And it's forecasting a 40% jump in the numbers in need. I mean, what countries are we talking about?
Well, the UN has targeted 56 countries, which is already pretty concerning. It estimates 235 million people around the world. Some key areas: Syria, of course, Yemen, of course, Afghanistan, of course. But we have, for example, now this escalating conflict in Ethiopia, people fleeing into Sudan. Here's the kind of dilemma UN aid agencies face. In Sudan, the World Food Programme is already supporting refugees from South Sudan. Now, to feed the refugees coming over from Ethiopia, they have no extra money, so they've had to cut rations to the refugees from South Sudan. This is the awful situation that UN aid agencies fear increasingly they'll be faced with in 2021, because the big donor countries, United States, the European Union, United Kingdom, they are looking to cut aid so that they can support their own economies through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Imogen Folks. Beijing has introduced tough new laws to restrict the export of what it's described as controlled items. The export controls are widely believed to be in response to similar actions by the US on Chinese technology companies such as Huawei. They'll also affect the export of rare earth materials which are used in smartphones and wind turbines. Well, I'm joined by our Asia Pacific Regional Editor Michael Bristow. Tell us more about these new laws then, Michael, and how they'll affect trade.
Well, China's National Parliament passed these laws in October. They come into effect today. They give the government in China a broad range of powers to restrict a whole range of exports, technology, goods, services, essentially things which the Chinese government believes could be used to harm national security of China. So we're talking about stuff which can be used for dual-use purposes in nuclear technology, military technology, things like that. You mentioned there rare earths. China it's the biggest supplier of rare earth elements. These are used, as you indicated, in a whole range of products vital for the production of so many things across the world. China has the biggest supply of them. If it restricts the export of these, then many businesses will come under great pressure. This law builds on regulations the Chinese government has already put into place, targeting particular countries and limited export of technologies earlier this year.
And why now?
Well, the Chinese government isn't saying exactly why now, but it seems obvious that it's to do with the trade war between the United States and China, and specifically the restrictions which the United States under President Trump has put on Chinese businesses, restricted their operations in all kinds of ways. Huawei, you mentioned there, is just the biggest example. The United States has tried to limit its operations in America. It's also restricted the amount of technology that Huawei can have. All kinds of companies have faced these restrictions as well. So it seems quite clear that China's basically retaliating against these American restrictions.
Michael Bristow, you're listening to The Newsroom here on the BBC World Service, and still to come, an incredible rescue at sea.
Hi, good morning. This is motor vessel Angeles. We just rescued one person from a capsizing boat.
More on that coming up, but first Jerry has the headlines this hour.
The top US infectious disease expert Anthony Fauci says the country is going through the worst phase of its coronavirus outbreak since the start of the pandemic. The United Nations is making its biggest ever appeal for humanitarian aid, saying millions more people need help because of COVID-19. And a Dutch court is hearing a case brought by environmental campaigners accusing the oil company Shell of deliberately hindering efforts to phase out fossil fuels.
A new analysis by independent scientists suggests the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement are coming within reach. The Climate Action Tracker study looked at new climate promises from China and others, plus the carbon plans of US President-elect Joe Biden, aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions which are responsible for global warming. Nicholas Hone is one of the scientists tracking the data.
The temperature number that we get by the end of the century is usually in the order of 3 degrees or a bit lower, and that means catastrophic climate change. But something has changed in the last few months, and actually our new number on an optimistic scenario now goes to only 2.1 degrees by the end of the century, and that is very positive news.
Our environment correspondent Matt McGrath told us more about the reasons for optimism.
That's certainly a major part of it. China has put forward a new plan in September at the UN where they said they would reduce their carbon emissions to net zero by 2060. President-elect Biden says he'll do that for the US by 2050. A number of other countries, South Africa, Canada, the UK, the EU, have all said similar things. So when you add up all those promises together, they turn out to lower temperature gauge for the end of the century down to 2 degrees. Now, if you consider that 10 years ago, and for the last 10 years, these scientists have been saying if you add up the plans, they add up to 3 to 3.5 degrees, which they would consider a disaster for the planet. They believe that reducing it to 2 or 2.1 is a very good start. It's very good progress, but certainly nobody's crowing that climate change has been solved. There's a lot of issues to be dealt with yet, but they see this as a significant step forward.
Well, indeed, these are long-term plans, aren't they? What about the near term?
That's the real weakness here. Right now, the Climate Action Tracker scientists say that by 2050, the promises are very good and that would bend the temperature curve by the end of the century. But it's the short term. That's where the real difficulties are. Over the next 10 years, they say practically none of the countries, all these China, US, UK, none of their plans in the short term actually keep them on track to be net zero by 2050. So there's going to have to be some serious thought given by politicians to what changes they can make over the next 10 years to bring those plans into line with their long-term promises.
And there are some real problems, aren't there, happening in the world? I'm thinking of the fact that the deforestation of the Amazon in Brazil, that's the highest since 2008.
Yeah, the situation with Brazil is really a worry on the international stage. But it has to be said that the countries like Brazil, Saudi Arabia and others who have been slow to move on climate change and have been reluctant to embrace the international position, in many ways they've taken a great deal of comfort from US President Donald Trump and his rejection of the Paris Treaty over the last number of years. That has now changed. It's likely that US President-elect Joe Biden will go back into Paris, and that means the international coalition on climate change is getting stronger. So it'll be interesting to see whether countries like Brazil continue to go their own way, continue to cut down their forests at record rates, or whether they will perhaps come on board with the international collaboration that countries are trying to get in place by the time they have a next big conference in Glasgow next year.
Matt McGrath. Well, let's return to the coronavirus. And doctors are still learning a great deal about it, and more is emerging about the longer-term effects of the disease. A study from Oxford University has found that COVID-19 could cause lung abnormalities which are detectable more than 3 months after the initial infection. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh explains.
The researchers were puzzled by a group of patients that had COVID but didn't seem to recover from it, a condition known as long COVID. The scans of their lungs had shown their lungs seemed to be normal until they tried an experimental technique which involved breathing in a non-toxic gas called xenon, and that did indeed show there was damage to their lungs, affecting the flow of oxygen into the bloodstream. So this was a very small trial. Researchers now want to expand it to see how widespread this may be. Although we've got a word for it, long COVID, we really don't know what it is, how many people suffer from it, and whether they can be treated. If this larger study does pinpoint the lung damage as being one of the causes, then that's a starting point to try and find out how prevalent it is. And also, it could be the starting point of developing a test to find out if you have got it, and perhaps even a treatment.
Pallab Ghosh. India has the second highest number of COVID cases in the world after the US, and November was the deadliest month for the capital, Delhi. The city is struggling to contain the virus with more than 100 deaths on some days. A lack of social distancing at the city's markets has been blamed for the recent uptick in cases. Some hospitals have run out of ICU beds, with pollution and cold weather adding to the burden. Our South Asia correspondent Rajini Vajanathan reports.
Early morning here in Delhi, and in recent weeks people say that they've just been hearing the wailing of sirens on a more regular basis. As the death toll from COVID-19 in the city climbs. At a mortuary in the east of the city on a cool November morning, we've come to meet Jitendra Singh Shanti, a volunteer ambulance driver whose charity runs a fleet of vehicles which transport the bodies of COVID-19 victims.
We will collect the bodies from here in our ambulances and take them to crematorium grounds. Corona cases were going down, but now we have seen another peak. So far, more than 2,000 people have died in Delhi this month.
About 2,000 से ज़्यादा लोगों का दिल्ली के अंदर मर जाना.
After picking up 3 bodies from the mortuary, we arrive at the crematorium, which has a special section for coronavirus victims. Shanti and his team unload the bodies wrapped in cloth onto stretchers.
Early in the year, when Delhi hit its peak, we used to bring 5 to 10 dead bodies. But now, the average is around 20 to 25. It's 11 a.m. right now, and by evening, this is completely full, and there's no space to cremate.
In a nation divided by rich and poor, COVID-19's become a leveller, with even the wealthy finding it hard to get beds. Many intensive care units are full with waiting lists. We were given access to the private Max Hospital in Delhi. We've just entered the ICU unit of this hospital. Every single bed is full. Staff wearing full PPE are treating the patients. This ICU is at full capacity. Anju Singh couldn't get into the ICU. She's being treated for COVID at the emergency ward. Now past the worst of the virus, she had this warning for others in the city.
People aren't taking precautions. They're running around in the markets. They're not wearing masks. They're careless and casual with things.
And with another lockdown unlikely in Delhi for economic reasons, avoiding careless behaviour is the only way to avoid a further spike in cases, says Dr. Sandeep Budiraja, the Group Medical Director for Max Hospital.
I think outside the hospitals, people have a feeling that this can't happen to me. I will not get this problem. It is most crucial that people understand that it is their own behavior which will determine how the disease goes in the next few weeks or next few months.
Dr. Sandeep Budiraja ending that report by Rajini Vajanathan in Delhi. And Jerry has some other stories from our news desk.
Relief agencies and medics say 7 children have been killed in rebel shelling of government-held districts of Yemen in the past 2 days. 5 children were among 8 civilians killed on Sunday in Al-Dirahimi on the Red Sea coast. 2 young girls are reported to have died in the city of Taiz on Monday. Doctors Without Borders has appealed to all armed groups to do all they can to avoid civilian casualties. In Sweden, a mother has been arrested on suspicion of locking her son inside their apartment for years, leaving him undernourished and with almost no teeth. Police say the man had been captive for a very long time, but wouldn't comment on media reports that he'd been in captivity for almost 3 decades. 2 of the world's biggest chocolate companies are being accused of avoiding paying a bonus that helps boost the incomes of poor cocoa farmers. According to Ghana and Ivory Coast, Hershey's and Mars have failed to pay the so-called living income differential, which adds $400 per tonne to the market price.
The US Coast Guard in Florida has described the rescue of a sailor who survived by clinging to the bow of his capsized motorboat as incredible. Stuart B., who's 62, had spent a night hanging on to the sinking 32-foot vessel called the Stingray in the sea more than 80 miles off Cape Canaveral. This is the moment his rescuers on the Liberian container ship Angeles told the US Coast Guard the good news.
Hi, good morning. This is motor vessel Angeles. We just rescued one person from a capsizing boat.
Okay, Captain.
And for the moment, the guy is okay. Yes.
Do you have a name for the gentleman?
Not yet. Not yet. We will ask. My crew is taking care of him. Give him some blankets. B is the name of the guy.
Roger that, sir. Stuart B. Yeah, we heard you, sir.
Stuart B.
Yes, sir. That is the gentleman that we've been looking for. That is the gentleman we've been looking for. Thank you.
I'm very happy for this.
Yes, so are we. Thank you so much.
Alive.
Our correspondent Peter Bowes describes how Stuart B. survived up to the point of rescue.
Stuart B. had been sleeping when he was suddenly awakened by water pouring into the boat's cabin. According to the US Coast Guard, the force of the water pushed Mr. B. out of the vessel's front hatch. With most of the boat submerged, he clung on to the bow. He stayed there all night before spotting a container ship in the distance. To get the crew's attention, Mr. B. removed his shirt and started waving it. He was rescued when the ship got close enough to throw him a lifebuoy. The Coast Guard said it was a truly incredible outcome and one which demonstrated the bond among all mariners and their community.
Peter Bowes reporting on a very lucky man. Finally, if you celebrate Christmas, you'll know it's a season filled with tradition, some global, some national, perhaps some particular to your own family. Well, one tradition shared by millions is the sending of Christmas cards. And now, in the first week of Advent, that custom seems for many to be more important than ever. The newsroom's Jonathan Savage told us more.
Hands up if you've not seen much of your friends and family this year. Even in normal times, Christmas cards are a decent way of keeping in touch. A gesture to show those that you don't see so often that you're still thinking about them. A reminder to them that you still exist. And these are not normal times. So here we have a survey by the pollsters YouGov that suggests most British people are placing higher importance on festive messages this year, and 1 in 10 intend to send more than they usually do. With Brits accounting for half of Europe's 2 billion Christmas cards, that could mean millions more being stuffed into those famous red pillar boxes. Who could object to that?
Well, I think the Christmas card is a very good thing, but there are problems associated with it.
Oh, that's Alexander McCall Smith, the novelist who sold tens of millions of books translated into 46 languages. He knows a thing or two about writing.
It creates a great deal of anxiety because there's this issue about who you're going to send the Christmas cards to, who you're going to cut off your list. That's another major problem for people. We all get these Christmas cards where nothing is said in the Christmas card and you just get a signature, sometimes illegible. That creates another problem. There's a great deal of anxiety caused by Christmas cards arriving and you can't work out who sent this Christmas card.
Okay, I'm getting stressed just thinking about it. So maybe one of the ways this Christmas could be different is by taking the stress out of it and not sending a card at all. But that could be tough if you're in one of the many countries where seeing family is not going to happen like it usually does. The UK is planning a 3-household limit across 5 days. Canada, another big card country, has been told by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that a normal Christmas is right out of the question. In France, restrictions will only be lifted for the holidays if case numbers come down to fewer than 5,000 a day. I could go on, but unfortunately, I've run out of time. Those Christmas cards won't write themselves.
I expect one very soon. Jonathan Savage there, ending this edition of The Newsroom.
Now on the BBC World Service, today's BBC Minute update on the coronavirus.
With Simeon Akwesi.
The United Nations is appealing for a record $35 billion to provide humanitarian aid around the world next year.
It says the number of people needing economic help will be much higher due to the coronavirus.
Meanwhile, COVID-19 could be causing lung damage, which leads to tiredness more than 3 months after patients are infected.
So says researchers at Oxford University. They are planning a larger trial to assess whether the lungs heal over time.
President Trump's special advisor on the coronavirus, Scott Atlas, has resigned.
During his 4 months in the role, Dr. Atlas questioned the need for masks. He often clashed with members of the coronavirus task force on other pandemic control measures.
British Formula One race driver Lewis Hamilton is self-isolating with mild COVID-19 symptoms after testing positive.
We end with the promise of several effective treatments to fight COVID-19 becoming available soon.
For more on the safety of the jabs, search BBC Who Decides If Vaccines Are Safe.
BBC Minute.
I'm Dr. Hannah Fry.
And I'm Dr. Adam Rutherford, and we're here to solve your everyday science mysteries, the things you've always pondered, your curious cases.
Today we have the curious case of the tigon and the liger.
So you get these when lions and tigers interbreed. So what determines whether species can interbreed? Why aren't ligers and tigons the same?
And what about zedonks and hebras, or growlers and pisleys?
You're just making them up now.
Well, maybe. Join us to find out more in Discovery after the news from the BBC.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The most senior infectious disease expert in the United States says the country is going through the worst stage of its coronavirus outbreak. Anthony Fauci told the BBC new records appear to be set every day. The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development has predicted a gradual but uneven recovery in the global economy. The OECD says overall economic activity is likely to reach pre-pandemic levels by the end of next year, but performance will differ markedly between countries. Environmentalists in the Netherlands have taken the oil firm Shell to court over its global exploitation of fossil fuels. They argue that Shell broke Dutch law by knowingly hindering the worldwide phasing out of oil and gas. The authorities in the Brazilian city of Criciúma say a heavily armed gang has carried out simultaneous bank robberies at multiple sites. Explosions and gunfire could be heard across the city. The World Bank has criticised the Lebanese authorities for a lack of effective action in the face of the dire economic crisis. It predicts that poverty is likely to engulf more than half the population. 7 children are reported to have been killed in Yemen over the past 2 days during Houthi rebel shelling of government-held areas. 2 girls died on Monday in a bombardment of the city of Taiz. A court in the Pakistani city of Lahore has asked police to explain why no criminal case has been registered against the national cricket captain Babar Azam after a woman accused him of rape. The woman alleges that police refused to record her statement. And German police have confiscated weapons during raids linked to a far-right extremist group that has just been banned. The Interior Minister said there was no place in Germany for organisations that want to re-establish a Nazi state. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the Curious Cases of Rutherford and Fry on Discovery for the BBC.
This is the programme where you send us in the queries, questions and conundrums that you are curious about, and we will look into them on your behalf using the power of science.
So please do send us your questions, curious cases, at bbc.co.uk, and on with the show.
A menagerie of crossbreeds and a bag of strange names for this curious case sent in by James G on Twitter. He wrote to us with today's question.
Today I learnt that tigons and ligers are what you get when lions and tigers interbreed. So what determines whether species can interbreed, and why aren't ligers and tigons the same?
Okay, well, given that you are our resident geneticist, Adam, I'd say this one sounds like it's quite up your street. So go on then, Smarty Pants. What is the difference between a tigon and a liger?
Well, that sounds like the beginning of a really bad joke, but a liger is the offspring of a male lion with a female tiger, and a tigon is the other way round.
And they're different?
Yes, they are.
Can you tell the difference?
No, I can't. They both look like big, scary cats.
If I showed you a picture of both of them, would you be able to tell which was which?
Nope.
But they're different?
Yes.
Okay, this is ridiculous. Are they the same species?
No, they're hybrids.
Okay, that's that solved then. That's the end of Curious Cases this week.
Now, hold on to your zedonks here, because this idea of how you define a species is actually one of my favourite subjects of all, and it's about to get real messy.
Why? Surely deciding what's a species is one of the absolute basics of biology.
Well, you'd like to think so, wouldn't you? Except that it all went very wrong at the very beginning. People have been trying to define life for thousands of years. Aristotle made a decent fist of it in the 3rd century BCE, but he also thought that dolphins snored, so maybe park that one for now. It was the 18th century Swedish accountant, dork and obsessive classifier Carl Linnaeus who had the first proper stab at trying to scientifically label all the things. During the course of his life, he published 13 editions of Systemae Naturae, his grand work of taxonomy, the systematic naming of all things. His scheme was so successful that we universally use it today, genus and species in Latin. So we are Homo sapiens, there's Tyrannosaurus rex, the dog is Canis domesticus, and then there's Felix catus.
You made that one up.
No, Felix catus is the cat.
So hang on, genus Felix, species catus.
Both mean cat.
That's ridiculous.
Well, you better strap in because it's going to get really wild now, because actually it turns out that loads of species are named twice. They're that good. So there's Buffo.
What's that?
That's the common toad. There's a mollusk, which is called extra.
Amazing. Because the genus and the species have the same name.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
But then I think my absolute favourite example is the gorilla.
Mm-hmm.
So genus name, gorilla.
Mm-hmm.
Species name?
Gorilla.
So it's gorilla. But there's also another level of taxonomy below species, which is called subspecies. So there's the eastern gorilla and the western gorilla. And the eastern gorilla has the dubious honour of being named after Friedrich Robert von Beringi, because it's gorilla beringii. Mm-hmm. He was the first person to shoot one.
Sure, I can see why they'd want to honour that.
Now, the western gorilla, the subspecies name is gorilla. So the full name of the western gorilla is...
Gorilla.
Yep.
Amazing.
I know.
Can't make this stuff up. Okay, this whole naming convention seems pretty straightforward then. Find a species, give it a name, repeat it 2 or 3 times. What's the issue here?
Well, the main problem with this scheme is that, like most people of his time, Linnaeus was a creationist. So he believed that the God of the Bible had created all creatures, and most people did at this time. And so what he was doing is he was striving to name all living things in their perfect, unchangeable form. So, this duck is the definitive duck, and it is the duck against which all other ducks are going to be compared.
Is that the problem then? Because the duck right now isn't going to look the same as a duck in 10,000 years' time. Everything's continually changing. Evolution is happening.
Precisely, because Charles Darwin came along and pointed out that living things are 4-dimensional. We don't just occupy space, we occupy time as well, and species are always changing.
But hang on though, Darwin, he wasn't against the idea of a species. His big famous book was called On the Origin of Species. He was quite happy with the idea, no?
Yes, but the question is, how do you define a species? And that's, I think, what this whole programme is actually about. It's a really simple question to ask. But, well, I put this question to Professor of Genetics at Trinity College Dublin, Aoife McClysett.
Well, I think it's a bit of a lie to call that a simple, straightforward question, because it's one that people still debate. But probably a useful and practical answer to that question would be that a species is animals or plants or whatever that are capable of mating and producing fertile offspring. So that's not a perfect definition, but it's one that works pretty well.
Okay, so if 2 animals can have a baby, and if that baby can have babies, then they're the same species.
Pretty much, which is why ligers and tigons aren't new species, because they're both born infertile, which effectively makes them an evolutionary dead end.
Okay. Well, this is easy then. This is done.
Well, note that Aoife said that the definition worked pretty well. See, the problem is that it's fine most of the time. And I don't know, but that's not much for a scientific rule, is it?
No, maybe not. But I want to know another thing. If ligers and tigons are infertile, how do you end up getting new species then? They can't always be dead ends in the tree of life, can it?
Right. So this is a process that we call speciation, and there are loads of ways that it can happen. Here's Aoife again.
We call that process speciation, but there's more than one way that can happen. So some of the ways it can happen are that there can be some physical barrier to interaction between a group of animals. Let's just say we're talking about animals for the sake of simplicity. And that could be a geographic barrier, say a river or mountain range or things like this. That means they can't interact, and then over time they just become different enough that if they were to meet again, they wouldn't be able to mate with each other.
That all makes sense, I think, where one island splits off from another and animals are left to evolve completely independently.
Yeah, there are thousands of examples of this. My favourite is bonobos and chimpanzees. So bonobos are pan-paniscus and chimpanzees are pan-troglodytes.
You love the Latin.
I love a bit of Latin. And what we think happens there was a common ancestor, what we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the Congo River didn't exist at this time, and then it comes charging along, separated out one group from another. And that was about 1.5 million years ago. And then they continue to evolve separately. And eventually you have chimps on one side and bonobos on the other.
And chimps and bonobos can't have babies?
We don't think so. They do look so similar that they were only classified as separate species relatively recently. They do look different, though, because bonobos always have a centre parting. That's true.
Is it always a geographical boundary, then, that causes speciation?
No, but that is one really important way. It turns out that there are loads of ways that this can happen. So sometimes it can be a change in behaviour. But the interesting thing is that this can happen really quickly. But when I say quickly in evolutionary terms, it's not really quickly in the same way that most people think of it.
Generally, we're talking about really, really long periods of time, because when we're talking about a genetic incompatibility building up between two groups such that they are then not able to reproduce, and so they're separate species, we're talking about lots of little changes accumulating, and these only accumulate with the passage of generations. And it takes a lot of those generations to get a significant amount of change. So yeah, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years usually.
Wait, I don't know if I totally understand this, because if you're using that definition that two can have babies and their babies can have babies, isn't that kind of a discrete thing? I mean, you either can or you can't. How does that happen over hundreds of thousands of years? Isn't there just a moment where it breaks?
Well, thus speaks a mathematician, because biology just refuses to adhere to your tyrannous rules. The answer is we don't really know. There are so many different ways that speciation can occur, and it's not just the physical, it's also at a genetic level, and it's not very well understood. So it's a rule that can be violated because it appears to be quite leaky.
That's different ways that speciation can occur for some definition of species that no one's quite happy with.
Yep.
Okay, well, my friend, before you get too haughty about maths, let me bring some maths to your biology party, because on Twitter, I noticed fellow mathematician Kit Yates from the University of Bath posting a picture of a fantastic beast.
So I've been reading a research paper and I tweeted this image of a hybrid animal, and it's a hybrid between a zebra and a piebald horse. It looks a bit like a zebra that someone's tipped a bucket of white paint over from just behind the head to the middle of the body, and then they've come back and for good measure they've dipped the legs in the white paint as well.
So what are these things called?
Any zebra crossed with another animal is called a zebroid, so that's just a generic term for zebra hybrids. But this particular one that we've been talking about is a hebra, which is a cross between a male horse and a female zebra. They sound amazing as well as looking amazing. If you cross it the other way around...
Hebra?
Yeah, right, exactly. If you cross it the other way around and you cross a male zebra with a female horse, then the offspring's known as a zorse. So you can start to see what they did there.
Well, I've heard of a zedonk, but I think a zorse and a hebra, I think he's just making these up.
Says Mr. Latin over there. Well, okay, let me test you on another one. Do you know what a cross between a grizzly bear and a polar bear are called?
Go on, tell me.
Pizzlies or growler bears?
That's hiding the fact that these beasts are probably terrifying.
It sounds quite cute, a little pizzly bear. Anyway, the stripes on a zedonk or a hebra are actually very interesting from a mathematical patterning point of view. And this is a story that features one of the greatest heroes of mathematics.
There are a few different patterning mechanisms that come about when you are interested in the way that animals get their pigment. So the zebras, for example, one theory is by Alan Turing, who is probably most famous for his work in code breaking during World War II. But in mathematical biology, we claim him as one of our own. So he had this theory where you have chemical species that move around the embryo when it's developing, and they interact with each other, forming what's called a pre-pattern. And this pre-pattern tells things where to grow, or it tells which genes to turn off and on, or it tells cells to produce pigment or not. And so he had this idea that you could take these two chemical species that react with each other. One One's the activator, it enhances itself in another chemical. One's called an inhibitor, it inhibits its own production and inhibits the production of the other chemical. And after some toing and froing, they settle down to what's called an equilibrium, so nothing interesting happens. And then Turing thought, well, that's going to be boring, so I'm going to add something else. So he added diffusion. And now if you take a glass of water and you put a drop of food colouring at the bottom, then the way it slowly spreads out and eventually evenly colours the water is through diffusion, the random motion of water molecules. But again, that sounds really boring. It's just making things uniform. So Turing's crazy, mad idea was to combine this stable reaction system with this stabilising force of diffusion in the hope it might produce patterns. And actually what he did in this paper was to prove that it could produce patterns. And the great thing is that if you simulate these equations that he wrote down, then you see all sorts of fascinating patterns if you play around with the model. So you see spots on a ladybird, or rosettes like you get on a jaguar, or labyrinthine patterns like you see on a brain coral, or stripes like you see on a zebra or on a tiger. So it's an amazing idea from this brilliant, brilliant mind.
Now, I really love it when maths and biology combine, because that's you and me, isn't it? I mean, this is Curious Cases gold.
Yeah, totally. There is something really, really lovely about this idea. And I know that when you hear it and you're talking about activators and inhibitors and chemicals and blah, 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 it sounds like it's very, very complicated. But there is actually a really simple way that I like to imagine this process. If you imagine yourself sort of sitting above a forest, looking down on a forest, and in this forest you've got loads of rabbits. Now, the more rabbits you have, the more rabbits you're going to get. They kind of have a habit of breeding. And the more rabbits you have, the more likely you are to have foxes. But as soon as your fox population increases, that's going to inhibit your rabbit population. So the very clever thing that Turing did to really embed space into this model was he said that the foxes need more space. They spread out much more quickly than the rabbits do. If you kind of create a mathematical system that has those properties, what you end up with is foxes kind of scattered around your forest, and then little pockets where there are lots and lots of rabbits all clustered together, surrounded by a moat of foxes. So if you look down on it, it's as though you have these spots, these patches of rabbits in a forest of foxes. And that really is what's going on in skin pigmentation of cheetahs and of giraffes and of all kinds of animal patterning.
I absolutely love that. And the reason I love it is because you see exactly this in embryology, so in the way that embryos develop. And you see it in loads of different species. So, for example, feathers, right? So birds have feathers, and feathers need to be evenly distributed. You don't want them in a cluster in one place and then have a big bald spot, because that's not going to help you fly. And we know that you get your rabbit and fox analogy working exactly in how the cells decide that they're going to be feather cells and not the ones in between. And so you get this perfect distribution.
Okay, back to the question then. What is a species? And so far, the best but imperfect definition of a species is organisms that can make fertile offspring. But the question was also about hybrids. Why aren't ligers and tigons the same? And you, Adam Rutherford, said that they are different. Why?
Well, because we inherit most of our DNA from both parents, but you inherit different sex chromosomes from your mother and your father. And this is where it gets real juicy, as Aoife McLeisert told me.
There's this observation that if there is some leakiness in that process, if sometimes the hybrid is fertile, it tends to be the females who are fertile, or more correctly, not the females, but the homogametic sex, which are the ones who have two of a kind of the sex chromosomes. So in mammals, we're familiar with the XY sex chromosomes. So females are XX and males are XY. Because females have two of a kind, we call them homogametic. But in birds, for example, it's the opposite way around. So there's this thing called Haldane's rule, which is when you have these hybrids, if there's sterility is more likely in the heterogametic sex, which for most of the things we're looking at and thinking about, it's going to be the males.
Haldane's rule, sterility is more likely in the heterogametic sex. You biologists, you really don't like using simple words.
I know. But, ligers and tigons aren't even great examples for studying this kind of thing because, well, they reproduce really slowly, they're really big, they only do it in zoos, they never meet in the wild or the lab, they're utterly terrifying. But there are loads of species that we can study in great detail because they're smaller and much more user-friendly.
As in they won't eat you?
Not being eaten by your research subject subjects is a life goal for most biologists. So what we do is we study insects and fishies, and guess what?
Tell me.
These critters seem to be able to hybridize all the flipping time, and their babies are fertile. So I spoke to Joanna Meyer from University of Cambridge because she is studying speciation and hybridization in butterflies and fish.
Hang on. You can hybridize a butterfly with a fish?
No, you can't. She studies them separately. Anyway, it turns out that Joanna is not totally cool with the question of what defines a species.
That's actually a surprisingly difficult question. We used to think that species are just groups of animals or plants that don't hybridize, so don't interbreed with each other. But recently we've been realizing more and more that many we think are clear species are actually still able to hybridize. And so we are reconsidering this now, and it's quite under dispute. But my species concept, the way I use it, is if two groups of animals or plants are coexisting, like living in the same place, and don't merge back into a single group, then I would consider them two different species. So Adam, this question that seems very, very easy to answer is actually like my most dreaded question ever, because it's really, really difficult and there's a lot of dispute. What is a species is really hard to answer.
But it sounds like the version you're using, it's more a sort of practical answer than a sort of, this is the perfect description of what a species is, because there isn't one, is there?
That's true, yeah.
I suppose that this is a perfect example of how, unlike in physics, biology is a science absolutely crammed full of exceptions. And for all of our rules, they're more like guidelines.
Yes, exactly. It's kind of like when you look at the mountain landscape, you see that there is mountains, and you are very sure that those are mountains, just like we are very sure that species exist. But then sometimes you see a hill in between, or sometimes it's not quite clear where a mountain stops and where the next one starts.
Joanna's work is on one of the most exciting animals that we study in evolution. They're called cichlids, and they're little fishies in Lake Victoria and some of the other huge lakes in Africa. And we know they've only been there for a few thousand years because we know that Lake Victoria is a relatively young lake. But these cichlid fishes have been having a wild evolutionary party for the last few millennia.
In Lake Victoria, for instance, which is only 15,000 years old, 500 new species evolved. And they're extremely different. Like some species feed on snails, others feed on algae. Some have even evolved to feed on other cichlid fish. So they're extremely diverse. And usually they wouldn't hybridize in nature. But sometimes, for instance, when the water is very turbid, they don't see very well. And if they don't see it that well, they may hybridize and mate with the wrong species.
Wait, they accidentally mate with other species when they can't see them properly?
Well, we've all been in a smoky club at one time or another, and, you know. But here's the thing. They don't...
Speak for yourself, Adam.
They don't interbreed all the time, but they are capable of interbreeding.
So if you put them in an aquarium and don't give them the choice, eventually they will breed with any of the closely related Lake Victoria species. But in nature, if they have the choice and the water is clear, they do not like to interbreed.
So it's a behavioural thing that is stopping them from interbreeding. It's not biological. They're perfectly capable of it, but they don't want to.
If they reproduce with someone from another species, the hybrids are usually a bit less good than the parentals. For instance, if a species that feeds on algae and has to scrape algae off the rock surface interbreeds with a species that feeds on zooplankton and has to swim fast behind zooplankton and suck it in, then the hybrid, which is intermediate between the two, may not be as good at scraping algae or as feeding on zooplankton. But interestingly, here we've already made experiments in the aquarium where one could see that then sometimes those hybrids are better at feeding on something else that neither parental species is good at. And this is how new hybrid species may evolve.
This is not what you said earlier. You said earlier that a hybrid offspring is infertile, and now Joanna is saying that these hybrid fish born of a smoky club can just go off and make a new species.
Well, I told you that biology is messy. It is possible to get a new species of cichlid fish when the parents are in fact two separate species beforehand. And that brings me to my next somewhat frustrated question. This whole conversation, in fact, this whole programme makes me think that in biology, in evolutionary biology, we've got a couple of major problems here. The first is that when we talk about trees, evolutionary trees, they branch from a single organism which branches into two, and that's how we've seen evolution proceed over the last 4 billion years. But you're describing loops. You're describing two branches going into one, which is not a tree-like structure at all. And the second is that our language doesn't work. When we say species, whatever the definition is, it's clear that the actual reality on the ground or in the water, we don't really have the language to describe it.
Yeah, that's true. It's more like a species continuum, where at the beginning you have two diverging populations and then eventually they may turn into something we call species. But where exactly we put the threshold is really difficult to do. And you're right, we don't really see it as a tree of life anymore. I think in the past few years we have realized that we should actually rather see evolution and the diversity of species as a web of life or a network of life.
Okay, let's summarise then. So species are defined as creatures that can produce fertile offspring, unless they can't.
Correct.
And hybrids are infertile, except when they aren't.
Exactly.
And the tree of life, which supposedly was one of the most important ideas in biology, is actually not a tree.
Not in the slightest.
Got it. Is this why you guys use so many complicated Latin words, just to cover up the big holes in your subject?
Yeah, it's a massive distraction from the fact that we don't really know what's going on. And we haven't even mentioned what I think is the very best example of exactly this confusion.
Which is?
Us.
Us? I mean, I like to think that we're important, Adam, but I don't think we can be held responsible for big gaping holes in evolutionary theory.
I actually mean you, specifically, because you, Hannah, are part Neanderthal.
Steady on.
Actually, I am part Neanderthal too, and in fact, pretty much everyone of predominantly European ancestry are part Neanderthal. And this shows exactly what a pickle we're in, because when our ancestors bumped into the Neanderthals, from whom they'd been completely separate for more than 500,000 years, they did successfully mate, and they did have fertile offspring, and we know that because we carry their genes.
Yeah, we do. So for me as a geneticist, that seals the deal when you're asking the question, were we the same species as Neanderthals? For me, the fact that Neanderthals are our ancestors, contemporary ancestors with anatomically modern humans, for me that means they must be the same species because we are the successful descendants of those matings.
Is she saying then that we are all Neanderthals, or is she saying that modern humans and Neanderthals are the same species?
Yes, she's saying that, the latter, that we're the same species. But I actually think that there's another way to look at it, which is that the problem is the word species. It's just not helpful here.
Well, maybe you could say not useful. I don't see how you can be the same species as one of your parents and not the other. For me, the biological species concept, the one that we mentioned at the beginning, you know, if you can produce fertile offspring, you are the same species. That makes sense to me as well. And clearly, Neanderthals are our ancestors just as much as the anatomically modern human they mated with.
You get far enough down the road of biology and all you see is just a load of professionals shrugging.
Well, congratulations, you have just passed your first biology exam. Look, biology, it's a science of exceptions. We try our best to have rules, but they're always just really leaky.
And there's lots of mistakes in taxonomy as well, which is a different thing than the definition of a species being not always useful. I remember one time hearing a talk where it was this botanist and he was talking about these two different species of cane that were distinguished in the field guide by the black markings that were on one and absent on the other. And then eventually they discovered these were burn marks and they're just the same species. But this happens.
Well, of course, it's great kudos to name a new species. And if you are the person that names it, then that's an important part of your scientific curriculum vitae.
Yeah, perhaps a slightly perverse incentive. You know, you want it to be a new one. Same thing probably happens with fossils. You don't want to find the 10th example of something we already know. You want to find the first example of something new.
Yes, and I suppose all of this is just us manifesting something I've talked about before in this programme, which is physics envy. We have rules and definitions, but they work about, I don't know, 3/4 of the time, half of the time, some of the time if we're feeling lucky.
They're more like themes than rules, aren't they?
Guidelines.
So, Dr. Radford, when it comes to tigons and ligers and pizzly bears, can we say oh my?
Yes, Dr. Fry, we can. They are hybrids, not species, because they are infertile.
But loads of hybrids are fertile and can become species.
And that includes us, because Neanderthals were our ancestors as much as Homo sapiens.
And biology is really quite a messy science.
Which is what makes it so exciting.
And full of Latin.
This is the BBC World Service, the host of an annual series of talks from the most prominent and influential thinkers from across the world.
Dr. Mark Carney delivers this year's Wreath Lectures. The former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England will reflect on how far economy affects and influences our society. Just how do economic markets shape the way in which we live?
The Wreath Lectures, Wednesday at 10 GMT. And in 60 minutes, the newsroom with Valerie Sanderson.
The US top infectious disease expert tells us his country is experiencing record rates of infection from the coronavirus. We look at the outlook for global economic recovery from the pandemic. And will you send a Christmas card this year?
Outlook is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Sister and brother Jane and Ian Brennan had a wonderful relationship growing up. Jane can hardly speak. She has Down syndrome, but she does have music.
It was a way of communicating. If you have a sibling who's nonverbal, dance and vocalization and singing are ways to relate to one another.
She didn't just teach her brother how to dance, she taught him how to listen too.
How to listen with your whole being, really, and to listen to what's not being said more than what is being said. And that's an ability that she has. I mean, there really is no foreign language to her.
Ian became interested in how music can help marginalised people and now records with groups all over the world, prisoners in Malawi, the homeless in California, and an extra special album with his sister and her friends. The power of music on Outlook after the news.
BBC News. Hello, this is Jerry Smith. The most senior infectious disease expert in the United States says the country is going through the worst stage of its coronavirus outbreak since the pandemic was declared earlier this year. Anthony Fauci told the BBC new records appear to be set every day. He said promising new vaccines were appearing swiftly and offering hope. But Dr. Fauci said disputes in the US over measures to stop the spread of COVID-19 have been damaging.
This has been a very difficult year for us. There has been a lot of divisiveness which has spilled over into how one views public health measures. It almost has become a political statement whether you wear a mask or don't wear a mask. That has made the implementation of public health measures very difficult.
The Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development says a gradual but uneven recovery in the global economy should take place in the next 2 years. In a new forecast, it says overall activity is likely to reach pre-pandemic levels by the end of next year. But the OECD says performance will differ markedly between countries. Environmentalists in the Netherlands have taken the Anglo-Dutch oil firm Shell to court over its global exploitation of fossil fuels. The 4-day case in The Hague will hear arguments that Shell broke Dutch law by knowingly hindering the worldwide phasing out of oil and gas. Donald Poles from the campaign group Friends of the Earth accuses Shell of hiding from its responsibilities.
The main argument of Shell is that everybody is responsible. The consumer, the state, the international community, everybody is responsible except Shell, except the biggest polluter of the Netherlands, one of the 10 biggest polluters in the world. Today we are asking the judge to force Shell to stop contributing to dangerous and disastrous climate change.
Shell says investment in new technology and changing customers' behaviour is a better way of tackling climate change. The authorities in the Brazilian city of Criciúma say a heavily armed gang has carried out simultaneous bank robberies at multiple sites, setting off explosions in the streets. Brazilian media say at least 2 people, including a policeman, were injured. Warren Ball reports.
Footage on social media showed the gang discharging their weapons as they arrived in Criciúma in a convoy of vehicles. Explosions and gunshots could then be heard in several places across the city as the gang exchanged fire with local police and raided banks. The gang set up roadblocks, took several hostages and forced other local people to sit in a line in the middle of the street. One clip posted on Twitter appeared to show passers-by picking up banknotes which had been strewn on the ground.
News from the BBC. 7 children are reported to have been killed in Yemen over the past 2 days during Houthi rebel shelling of government-held areas. 2 girls died on Monday in a bombardment of the city of Taiz. A day earlier, there were more deaths in the port city of Hodeidah. A court in the Pakistani city of Lahore has asked police to explain why no criminal case has been registered against the national cricket captain Babar Azam after a woman accused him of rape. The matter was made public on Monday when she held a news conference. Electra Naismith has more details.
Babar Azam is one of Pakistan's star cricketers, the only batsman in the world to make the ICC's top 5 across all formats of the game. The woman says she was exploited for years, having illegal premarital sex and even being forced into having an abortion. She says Azam promised to marry her, but when he became famous, things changed. She's accusing him of rape, blackmail and harassment, but says police in Nazirabad refused to record her statement. The court has demanded an explanation. Azam himself has yet to comment.
A Chinese spacecraft is preparing to land on the moon in the coming hours in the first mission for 4 decades to try to return lunar samples to Earth. The Chang'e 5 spacecraft started to orbit the moon at the weekend before detaching a lander. This will now attempt a soft landing in a volcanic area. If successful, the lander will spend several days scooping up samples before dispatching them back to the orbiter and returning to Earth. A 2-metre-high wooden sculpture of a phallus that's been amusing and baffling hikers on a German mountain has vanished. The object is thought to have been erected on Grunten Mountain in Bavaria by local youths as a May Day prank 4 years ago. Local people say cows had often knocked it over. And that's the BBC News.